here to lecture objective 2. So our second objective is to describe the chemical messengers and the receptors, receptor types associated with the peripheral nervous system. So this is really going to lend from or borrow from a discussion we had previously with 2 types of receptors. So in our previous unit, we talked about fast and slow receptors. And so you're really going to want to call on that information as we describe the autonomic neurotransmitters and their various receptors. So we spoke about, so we got 2 types of receptors. We've got cholinergic receptors and we've got adrenergic receptors. Cholinergic receptors only bind acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is one of the most abundant neurotransmitters in the body, and cholinergic receptors bind acetylcholine specifically. Adrenergic receptors, on the other hand, are less abundant, and they bind norepinephrine either as a neurotransmitter, like I just described, or as a hormone, which is circulating in the blood, in the vascular system. Adrenergic receptors can also bind epinephrine, right? So norepinephrine and epinephrine are like distant cousins. They can be converted to each other in the vascular system, but they're basically bringing about the same response because they can bind to the same type of receptor, but they just do so at differing affinities. And I'll talk about the differing affinities, okay? So cholinergic bind acetylcholine only, and then adrenergic bind norepinephrine as a hormone or as a neurotransmitter, as well as epinephrine. So let's speak about the neurotransmitters that are involved and where they're involved. This is kind of where this gets a bit tricky, so make sure you're paying close attention here. So we've got preganglionic neurons, that's that first neuron in the series of 2 neurons. All preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. All of them, irrespective of being in the sympathetic system or the parasympathetic system, all of our preganglionic neurons, so that first neuron, release acetylcholine. Now, parasympathetic postganglionic neurons release acetylcholine as well, but in the sympathetic system, the postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine, okay? So this is that second neuron in that series of 2 neurons. In the parasympathetic system, they release acetylcholine. In the sympathetic system, they release norepinephrine. Now I've got 2 asterisks here because there's a small exception to this rule. And I want you to make a note in your own notes that sweat glands are a small exception to this rule. Sweat glands, the sympathetic postganglionic neurons that go specifically to our sweat glands do not release norepinephrine, but instead they release acetylcholine. So a very small exception to this general rule. And then lastly, we've got hormones, which are coming from the adrenal medulla. 80% of that is going to be epinephrine, 20% is going to be norepinephrine. But in our distant vasculature, we have the ability to convert epinephrine to norepinephrine. And this is going to be able to bind to the adrenergic receptors that I described as well. So you can think about it as being just like the norepinephrine that comes from a synapse as a neurotransmitter. They're essentially the same. The only thing is the route that they use to get to their receptors. One is a neurotransmitter, so it's going to be that one-to-one release, whereas one is a hormone, so it's going to be widespread throughout the vascular system. All right. Okay, so this is a really nice schematic that shows a general overview of where these receptors are located and where the different neurotransmitters or hormones can be, where they can be found. So we're going to go through this one by one. We'll start with this first route of communication. So reminding ourselves that this is depicting those 3 routes of communication for the sympathetic nervous system specifically. So we've got a preganglionic neuron in light blue here, synapsing on to our, this is our sympathetic chain. This is the ganglia that's a part of our sympathetic chain. And then the second neuron synapsing out to our effector organ or effector tissue. And so what we see here is that all of our preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, right? Remember I made that distinction. So this preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine. This preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine. This preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine. The second neuron has receptors on it for this acetylcholine. So this is going to have nicotinic cholinergic receptors. And I'll go on to describe the difference between our two types of cholinergic receptors, but the nicotinic cholinergic receptors are fast receptors. We described the difference between fast and slow receptors in our previous unit. And so just make a note here that these are fast receptors, okay? Meaning that the receptor is the channel. And I'll talk more about that coming up. And so the second neuron is releasing norepinephrine. Remember, this is the sympathetic system. So the postganglionic neuron is releasing norepinephrine, which will bind to an adrenergic receptor on the effector tissue. The second route of communication, we've got this one preganglionic neuron also releasing acetylcholine that will bind to our chromaffin cells. Remember, this is the adrenal medulla. And on our chromaffin cells, we've also got nicotinic cholinergic receptors, which are fast receptors, and they allow for the release of epinephrine from the chromaffin cells, and that is going to be acting as a hormone. So that's going to be flooding the system as a hormone. So you want to make a note of this here. And then the third route of communication, we've also got a preganglionic neuron, also releasing acetylcholine that will bind to, again, a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, a fast receptor, which will then stimulate the release of norepinephrine from this second neuron. In this instance, it's acting as a neurotransmitter, and so it will bind to an adrenergic receptor as well. Okay, so you really want to understand the layout here, the three routes of communication, and then where we have different receptors, right? We've got nicotinic cholinergic receptors here, and then we've got adrenergic receptors on our effector tissues. Okay, the parasympathetic system is a little bit more straightforward. We've only got one route of communication. We've got this long preganglionic neuron. We've got this ganglia that's really close to the effector tissue. And as we mentioned before, all of our preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. And then in the instance of the parasympathetic system, our postganglionic neuron also releases acetylcholine. So it's really important for you to understand that none of the parasympathetic neurons ever come in contact with epinephrine or norepinephrine, and there are no adrenergic receptors that are involved here. The parasympathetic system only involves acetylcholine and only involves cholinergic receptors. But as I mentioned earlier, there are two types of cholinergic receptors, and as you can see here, one is a fast response, one is a slow response, and I'll talk more about that coming up, right? But we've got only cholinergic receptors. Okay, so here we'll just differentiate between our two types of cholinergic receptors. Now, we know the general rule is that a cholinergic receptor is a receptor that binds acetylcholine, but the way that they respond is how they differ. So a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, also called an ionotropic receptor, is a fast receptor. Again, this should be something familiar to us from our previous unit. And so because this receptor is also acting as a channel, that channel will open up. This will cause a depolarizing event on our second neuron. And that will allow the second neuron to release its contents, right? We're gonna have an action potential firing down that second neuron. And then we can have the postganglionic neuron releasing its neurotransmitter. So make sure you're tying in the events of the synapse here, right? These are also synapses. So make sure you're understanding what happens at the synapse. We're talking about a neuron. The axon terminal of that neuron has these vesicles that are storing these neurotransmitters that we're speaking about. And then when that action potential propagates down the neuron, we have releasing of these neurotransmitters. So make sure you're correlating and connecting all of that information we talked about with regard to the synapse. Now, the second type of cholinergic receptor is called a muscarinic receptor. This is described as being a metabotropic receptor. And as we should remember, this is a slow receptor. This is going to bring about a slow response. And it's also going to require a G protein coupled to this receptor, okay? This is going to bring about a different effect depending on where this receptor is found. So depending on the target cell that's associated here, this is going to bring about a different type of response. All right. Let's speak about the locations of these cholinergic receptors, and I'll probably jump back to that schematic diagram because it really nicely illustrated where these things are, where these receptors are in relation to one another. So the autonomic postganglionic neurons have nicotinic cholinergic receptors. And that makes sense because if all the preganglionic neurons are releasing acetylcholine, then all the postganglionic neurons must have cholinergic nicotinic receptors in order to bind that acetylcholine. The effector organs for the parasympathetic system all have muscarinic cholinergic receptors. So on our effector tissues, and I'll jump back to this schematic here. On our effector tissues, we've got this muscarinic, which is a metabotropic type of cholinergic receptor, whereas on the postganglionic neuron itself, we've got this nicotinic type of cholinergic receptor. So right away, we can see that there's going to be a difference in the speed of the response at these two locations. Because this is a fast receptor, we're going to have a fast, immediate response of depolarizing the second neuron, firing an action potential that propagates down this postganglionic neuron and releasing acetylcholine. Whereas on the effector tissue, we're going to have a more slow, more customized response depending on exactly where this receptor is, what type of effector tissue. And we're also going to have the involvement of second messenger. And I'll talk about those second messengers in a bit. So we've got a fast response here and a slow response here at the level of the tissues. Okay. And then in skeletal muscle, which is something we'll look at in the next unit, we only see nicotinic cholinergic receptors. So that's interesting and important to point out now that we're speaking about cholinergic receptors. When we look at skeletal muscle, we only have nicotinic cholinergic receptors. There are no adrenergic receptors. There are no muscarinic receptors involved with skeletal muscle. And we'll talk about that in our next unit. And then lastly here again, I'm reminding you about this small exception with sweat glands. Sweat glands are a unique case. They have neurons that are postganglionic, sympathetic, but they also release acetylcholine, so they also have cholinergic receptors. Okay, so a very small exception, to the rule.